Okay, it's 2:05. I think we want to go ahead and get started. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us during this webinar aimed at understanding and combating colorism in Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. This is a community outreach project of Island Liaison, an Arizona-based nonprofit organization serving as a resource for the local Pacific Islander community, and it has been made possible by the National Asian and Pacific Islander American Chamber of Commerce and Entrepreneurship. So before we get started into our introductions, I wanted to make a land acknowledgement. If you want to go to the next slide really quick. So tomorrow, October 10th, is Indigenous Peoples Day. So as such, I wanted to recognize that I'm coming to you all from O'odham land and the Hohokam who came before them. It's really important to acknowledge the original stewards of this land who continue to fight for equity and land back into Native hands. So please, after this webinar, I invite you to do your own research on whose land you reside on and how to help in local sovereignty efforts led by Indigenous people, especially considering tomorrow with the holiday. A good place to start is the website native-land.ca. I can stick that in the chat really quick. That'll show you whose land you're on and what tribes, and that way you can learn how to help. There's sometimes rent and payment efforts going on to these different people who are still fighting for their sovereignty. So thank you for that. I wanted to now introduce myself. My name is Leo Lubansky. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the community organizer for a local nonprofit called Arizona Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders for Equity. And I also serve as secretary and social media team member for Island Liaison. And we'll do a more complete introduction in a minute, but I wanted to pass it really quick to Joanne.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. And I just wanted to say thank you all for showing up on a Sunday afternoon. I am Dr. Joanne Rondilia, and I am an assistant professor in sociology and interdisciplinary social sciences, as well as Asian American studies at San Jose State University. My research focuses on Filipino-Filipinx communities, as well as Pacific Islander communities. Specifically, I look at the issue of colorism in the Filipino-Filipinx community. I am currently zooming in from San Mateo, California. This is the indigenous land of the Ramaitash and Muwekma Ohlone tribes. I am originally from the island of Guam, the land of the indigenous Chamorros, and it is my honor to be here today. Next slide, please. A little bit about me. This is just a smattering of some of the work that I have done. I have been a scholar for, it's kind of embarrassing, for about 20 years now. The first publication I ever worked on was a co-edited book called Pacific Diaspora. And my most recent work has been a few op-eds that I wrote for a publication called Visible Magazine. Next slide, please. And today we will be talking about colorism in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Next slide. And some key points. I want to make the webinar as brief but as effective as possible. So some key points. Today we will be talking about colorism. What is colorism? How does it impact Asians and Pacific Islanders? Number two, what are the connections between colorism and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism? And I will end by looking ahead. What are some future conversations about colorism that I actually would like to see generated from the community? And then, of course, we will end with a Q&A session. Next slide. So I wanted to start by actually sharing my own colorism story because it helps to contextualize how I started in this research. And so it actually starts with my mom. My mom and my aunts, you know, they're from the Philippines. They are from a town called San Pablo City. And the family lore, the story that I was always told was San Pablo City is the home of very beautiful women in the Philippines. And I used to think this was funny family lore until years later, one of my best friends in high school, her father learned that my mother was from San Pablo City, and his response was, "Oh, your mother must be beautiful because the beautiful women come from San Pablo City." So apparently there might be some truth to that. I'm not sure. But in my family, my mom, as well as some of my aunties, were provincial beauty queens. And so it sort of starts there. I grew up in a family, especially on my mom's side, where they really valued beauty. And beauty in my family was often, you know, relegated to people who are thin, the women who are thin, who are light-skinned, etc. And when you look at my mom next to me, we're very, our skin tones are very different. I often describe us as, my mother is, you know, vanilla ice cream and I'm burnt caramel. And so, but the way I got into the research was when I was a graduate student, I was also working as a makeup artist. So I had a front row seat tickets to engaging with women and observing their habits in terms of the beauty and skincare products that they would buy. I was also, you know, sitting in the front row seat with the company that I was working in as our skincare products broke into Asia. And I could see how a product in the United States that's touted as an anti-aging product, that same exact product, when it's sold overseas in different parts of Asia, is suddenly a skin lightening product. And I didn't know what to make of this, but I knew that there was some type of conversation there. So I felt that just who I was, you know, the family that I come from, the way that, you know, we valued, you know, my mother's side of the family valued beauty, as well as my background in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, as well as working in the cosmetics industry. I felt that these were factors that really helped to shape not just my own colorism story, but how I got into the research. Next slide, please. And so what is colorism? Colorism, the term colorism was coined by the writer Alice Walker. And in this text that you see in front of you, she talks about colorism in terms of, you know, with respect to Black women in the United States. And she talks about the way in which it is important for light-skinned Black women to acknowledge the way in which light-skinned Black women, whether consciously or unconsciously, you know, the way in which light-skinned Black women inflict pain upon darker-skinned Black women, right? You know, that there is this community conversation that needs to happen. And she basically says, unless the question of colorism is addressed in our communities and definitely in our Black sisterhoods, we cannot as a people progress. For colorism, like colonialism, sexism, and racism, impedes us. And so this is where we see the term colorism first surface and eventually popularize. Next slide, please. So what is colorism? Colorism is a looks-based system of discrimination that occurs within the same racial or ethnic group. And in this system of discrimination, it's where people with lighter skin, more pointed features are favored or granted more resources than those who are darker skinned. And ultimately, I argue colorism is in-group discrimination that helps to maintain anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. So the way colorism looks, say in the Filipino community, is light-skinned Filipinos discriminating against a darker-skinned Filipino. The way it looks in the Asian American community is a lighter-skinned Chinese person discriminating against a darker-skinned Cambodian person. So it's not exactly racism, because a question that I often get is there a difference, or what is the difference between colorism and racism? Colorism is a more intimate form of discrimination because it's discrimination that occurs within the same racial or ethnic group. Next slide, please. And so some of the historical legacies of colorism it actually falls in line with colonial history. And again, the bulk of my background looks at Filipinos and Filipinos in the Philippines, as well as Filipinos in the United States, the Filipinx community. And so there is this relationship between historical legacies of colorism and colonialism, and in this case, in the Philippines. In the slide that you see here, there is, this image comes from 1899, and this is around the time of the Filipino-American War, where you have the United States who, who had just won the Spanish-American War. The US acquired nations such as Cuba, Puerto Rico. It already acquired Hawaii in 1893, and then the Philippines. And one of the ways in which the US government would justify colonizing a place like the Philippines is to frame the Philippines as a place of, to frame Filipinos as savage people. And the way in which Filipinos were framed as savage is by way of skin color, and other physical features. And so when in popular media, you present the controlling image of Filipinos, and by extension, Asians and Pacific Islanders as savage, therein lies some of the roots of colorism. And I can elaborate more during the Q&A if you have more questions about this particular history. Next slide, please. And so when you frame a particular community as dark and savage, in comes not just colonialism, but also capitalism. Capitalism is the system that creates this, it creates the demand for cleanup, basically. And so again, when we look at this old ad, from 1899 by a company called Pear Soap, the way that they sell the soap is actually by selling not just the soap, but selling ideas of cleanliness, this idea of civilizing the savage, of cleaning up these savage people. And so, this was, not just a popular product at the time, but this was also a very popular advertisement that was running at the time. This idea of this soap basically cleaning up the dark corners of the earth, and it was about, it was about how the United States was basically going to clean up savage parts of the world, such as the Philippines or Puerto Rico, Hawaii, etc. And popular images like this, we often think of this as like, oh, these are things that happened in the past. But some of the messaging that we see in the Pear Soap ad, or some of the messaging that we see in old political cartoons, definitely surface in more contemporary advertisements, for skincare as well as skin lightening products. Next slide, please. So colorism in the Filipino or Filipinx community. Very quickly, as I was doing my research, there are some things that frame or shape colorism within the Filipinx community. And again, my research really focused on Filipino-Filipinx community, but I did work on a previous publication where we examined colorism in the Asian American community. For that study, a team of researchers from UC Santa Barbara conducted 99 interviews, and they conducted interviews of Asian Americans of various backgrounds. And so some of the bullet points that you see here are very similar. But for the Filipino-Filipinx community, some things that shape colorism would be one, the colonial history of the Philippines. In that instance, we have Spanish colonialism, American colonialism, Japanese occupation, the return to American colonialism, and then independence. Throughout these colonial processes, what is very consistent is the presence of the Chinese in the Philippines. And the Chinese were often elevated as they were often seen as having a higher status than, say, Indigenous Filipinos, because the Chinese historically made up the merchant class. And so they were seen as a little bit more civilized, more business savvy than, say, Indigenous Filipinos. And this component is actually what made, or what makes Filipino and Filipinx colorism very specific and very different than colorism in other communities. For example, colorism in the African diaspora, right? Because in the Filipinx community, when there's this desire for light skin, that desire is not just informed by European or Euro-American standards of beauty. It's also informed by East Asian lightness or East Asian standards of beauty. And that is in part because of the presence of the Chinese in the Philippines. This is also because of the proximity of China and East Asia to the Philippines. Some other things that shape colorism are representations of multiracial and multi-ethnic peoples. And I'm thinking about this specifically in popular media. Colorism is also, and this is something that I think becomes very sensitive, but yet essential when we're talking about colorism, is the way in which colorism erases Indigenous peoples and history, right? Especially within our own respective racial and ethnic group. And then the last component, the personal impact of skin tone discrimination in a person's daily life. When I was looking at the existing research on colorism, one of the things that was left out was, how do we as a community, how do people articulate ideas of colorism on an everyday basis to a point where it's so normalized, right? And how does that actually impact our understanding of beauty, of personal value, etc.? So there are all of these things at play. There's the structural things, right? Such as history, education, government, media representations, but there's also the personal things, right? The everyday conversations that we engage in without even thinking twice about it. Next slide, please. And so how is colorism articulated on the everyday? Oftentimes, so on my unit on colorism, when I teach in Asian American Studies, I often ask my students, has anyone ever said this to you? Don't stay out in the sun or you'll get too dark. And more often than not, at least 60% of the class raises their hands. They grew up hearing this, and I am no different. And it seems like, a very common thing that often mothers or aunties tell the cousins, like, don't stay out in the sun or you'll get too dark. And, it's so normalized that we don't actually second guess it. But for me, as a Filipino who was born and raised on Guam, to tell a child, don't stay out in the sun or you'll get too dark, like, this automatically negates you from everyday life on Guam, right? And you start to wonder, well, if everyone is at the beach, everyone stays out in the sun, like, why do I have to do this? And also, why is getting dark so bad, right? Other ways in which colorism is articulated has to do with dating and marriage. When I was conducting my interviews, I would ask interviewees, both in the US as well as the Philippines, what type of advice were you given about, the dating and marriage market? And oftentimes they were told not to date or marry someone who's dark, or interviewees would choose to not date or marry dark people for various reasons. And then another way in which colorism is articulated is, in the context of the Filipinx community, it's the exchange and the gifting of beauty products, in particular skin lightening products. So in the Philippines, if you're in the US and you go back home to the Philippines, oftentimes we have something called the Balikbayan box, and it's basically a box that you fill with American goods and you distribute these goods to friends and family. And, and it's a very well-known practice in the Filipinx community. But what's often not talked about is when that box returns to the United States, what's in the box, right? Tell me what's in the box. And in that box, oftentimes, are beauty products. products that you wouldn't be able to access here so readily in the United States. And those beauty products are often skin lightening products. Now with globalization, we do have, especially in areas where there are high concentrations of Asians, particularly Asian communities, in the grocery stores and in the beauty stores, you'll often see these skin lightening products. Next slide, please. And so, so what are the personal impacts of this? Don't stay out in the sun, right? And so here in one of my interviewees, she calls her, her pseudonym is Bambi, and she talked about, the process of her mother going to the Philippines and then coming back with papaya soap. And, and that's how she learned at a very young age how to use these skin lightening products. It's also how she learned at a very young age that when you stay out in the sun, there are consequences to that. And one of the byproducts of those consequences of staying out in the sun is having to use these special soaps or these special serums to lighten your skin. The same interviewee also talked about having to scrub her skin with lemon because her mother, again, did not want her to be dark. And so in the interview, she described how painful this was. She says, when you have an acid on your skin, that's painful enough. But if you have a cut and you and your mother are rubbing lemon on your skin, like, this is painful, right? And so there is this, a physical pain that oftentimes women have to experience because of this fear of getting dark. Next slide, please. And then this idea, don't date or marry dark people. Another interviewee that, was part of my study, she was in an interracial relationship, and eventually they got married, and her partner is African-American. And she described the evening that her mother and her brother found out that that she was dating this Black man, and there was a major altercation. There was a fight, and please note, not every family reacts this violently, but there was this physical altercation that happened, and she shared that story with me. And when I asked her, what was it? Why did your brother have this violent reaction where he basically choked you and your sister-in-law had to peel him away from you? Why was he so violently angry? And also, why did your mother support this, this altercation? And her response was concern about what people would think. So her quote, "What would people think of you? What would people think of our family? They're going to tell us we can't raise our own daughter." So oftentimes, in certain families, the reason why the dating and marriage choices that a daughter makes become so important is because it's a reflection of social capital, right? The daughter's ability to marry up, right? Or marry wealthy or marry light is a reflection on the family. And this is why when it comes to dating and marriage preferences or pressure, it often falls on the shoulders of the daughter or of the women. And mind you, these are in heteronormative relationships. Men have a different type of responsibility because men have a way out of this pressure. And historically, that the way that men were able to sort of segue out is by way of their education level, by way of their earning potential, right? So while there is pressure for men to, for example, be light or beautify, men do have an out that women historically have not had. Next slide, please. And then so colorism in the Pacific Islander community, and I wrote a few speculations. And the reason why I wrote a few speculations is because, again, my research really focuses on the Filipino-Filipinx community. I do think that when we look at the Pacific Islander community, there is a nuance that needs to be explored. And for me as a scholar, I do feel that that nuance needs to be explored within the community. Like, I am someone who is happy to work with people to engage in this, but it's not a project that I feel completely comfortable in, fully participating in, only because I do think that if you are part of a particular community, there's a nuance in which you can conduct the research that, say, I wouldn't be able to. So some speculations. One, it has to do with representation. Especially in the United States, when we look at the controlling images of people from Oceania, it's oftentimes Polynesians that dominate that representation. And that representation is made even more complicated because oftentimes these representations of Polynesians are not actually embodied by Polynesians themselves. It's often mixed race people who happen to be living in Hawaii, mixed race Asians that happen to be living in Hawaii. So there's an issue of representation that I think is an important factor when we start to examine Pacific Islander colorism. And then there's the colonial history of the Pacific, right? So for example, again, I have not done the deep dive, but many years ago when I was conducting research for a different project, one of the things I was sort of exploring was Native Hawaiian sovereignty. And in a footnote in a book, I found like a source that said that one of the slogans of the sovereignty movement, and this was during the time of, this was before the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. One of the sort of organizing mantras was, "It's in the skin," right? So, in that like small source that I found, there was something about, like skin tone and the physicality of, Native Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli, there was something about that identity. It's in the skin that helped people to hold on to their own identities. And so I had wondered, like, what is the correlation between, perhaps sovereignty movements and notions of skin tone? And then, of course, popular media in the Pacific. And in particular, I'm thinking about the presence of Asian people and media in the Pacific. And I want to credit Angela Edward, who does the podcast For Micronesians by Micronesians. In a conversation that she and I had, on her show, she had talked about how she and her family grew up watching Philippine media. Like, she was very well versed in Filipino movies, much more than me. And I wondered, and I posed this to her, I said, I wonder if, the presence of Philippine media or Asian media in the Pacific possibly informs a skin tone dynamic that may not have been there before that media had, was so easily circulated in the Pacific. And so again, because of these nuanced ideas, I do call for more research on colorism from within the community. And so if any of you who are listening, I'm happy to have these conversations with you. Next slide, please. And then future conversations. Of course, as I said, I would love to see more research developed, especially within Pacific Islander communities, more conversations developed in Oceania. I do think that as we advance these conversations, we need to engage in intersectional conversations. So something that I'm currently working on now with the team at San Jose State is we are exploring colorism in the LGBTQ+ community, Filipino community, right? Because, the question I've always had was, is there a correlation between, sexuality and colorism? We also have to be mindful of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, right? Because by framing colorism conversations as a move towards anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, we're moving beyond these conversations of whiteness and desired whiteness. And we're really looking at, why does colorism exist to begin with? And finally, something that I have constantly explored in my own research is the role of the intimate space, the space that we share within friends and family, and how we on the everyday articulate these anti-Black, anti-Indigenous ideas, right? And what can we do to stop ourselves so that we can foster future generations who don't have to be afraid of going out into the sun, who don't have to deny themselves, from engaging in a relationship with someone because of their skin tone. Next slide. And then Finally, healing and engagement. I like to end these conversations about colorism with that, because I'm often asked, how do we, like, how do we manage this? How do we grapple with these questions of healing and of colorism, right? So there are a couple of things. One is we have to understand that colorism, just like racism, is related to these larger structural issues: education, media representation, government, and history. And so how we engage in healing and engagement is, one, education, right? Education about our respective communities, but also education about our own respective families. Oftentimes we fall into the trap of not loving ourselves or not having a certain level of confidence because we are not rooted in the stories of our families. And I can say this for my own self, like, I actually do not know my family history beyond my parents. And this is very common among immigrants in the United States, especially the continental United States, because the idea is when you immigrate, you assimilate. And so you have American-born children who don't really have a sense of their own identity. And this is why there's this tendency to fall into, these beliefs that are rooted in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. Related to education is storytelling, knowing the history and stories of our families and the communities that we come from. And also understanding, again, that this dichotomy between structure and, the structural factors that inform colorism. Education, media representation, government, but there's also the personal ways in which we engage in these conversations. Next slide, please. And so finally, this is my last slide. Something that I want to pose to everybody is, there was something that brought you here. So what is it that brought you to this webinar? What is your understanding of colorism? How has today's webinar challenged or affirmed ideas on this topic? And also, what are some lingering questions you have? You may have some lingering questions that are immediate, and then you may have some questions that are going to occur to you in the next month or year or so, and that's perfectly fine. I think, again, that this engagement factor becomes very important. Next slide. And so that is the end of my talk. I want to thank you all for attending. Again, I know it's a Sunday afternoon. I would like to thank Island Liaison and National ACE and all of the, the hardworking team at Island Liaison for putting this together. And that's it for my talk. And I can now, I guess I could, I will hand the mic, I guess, to Leo and for the Q&A portion.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Angelia. That was amazing. I wanted to now officially open the floor up to questions, if anybody had any questions. Okay, so I do see a question. It seems more like maybe like a thought experiment kind of thing, but curious about how we can change the narrative regarding a culture's definition of beauty. So many people spend time and money on tanning salons. They're trying to get darker, but within our culture, we're also told to cover up. You don't want to get too dark, etc.
Yeah, so the tanning question, I think, is often an interesting one, because here's what I think we have to understand about tanning. If you're naturally dark, like, that has no value, right? Like that, but if you paid money to go on vacation or get like a tanning process, that's what has value. And so, like, I think it's important to understand the role of capitalism in these beauty practices, right? Because, and also too, what we have to remember about tanning is, like, when people go to tan, they're looking for something temporary. They wear their tan the way someone wears like their earrings or like a new pair of shoes. And that practice is very different from people who are trying to lighten their skin, because people who are trying to lighten their skin are looking for something permanent, right? Because they're associating light skin with the good things in life, better job opportunities, better dating, better dating choices, etc. Right? So they're two very different practices. And then in terms of like, how can we change the narrative? I think so much of this really should be rooted in understanding who we are historically and culturally, right? I'm pretty sure, when I think, for me as a Filipino, I'm pretty sure my ancestors did not worry about using Escanol and other skin lightening products, right? Like they had other things they valued other things, right? And so I often hark to Ipeli Hau'ofa when he has that epiphany and he says like, did my ancestors devalue themselves in the way I was taught to devalue myself? And when you look back at, when he says to look back at the myths and legends and really understand the greatness of who we were before these entities invaded and told us we weren't anything, I think that helps to shift the narrative.
Definitely. We also have a question. Dr. Rendilia, was there a defining moment in your childhood or early adulthood that sparked your interest in exploring colorism as a scholar?
So yes, there were a couple of things. One, and I shared it in an anthology piece that I wrote a few years ago. When I was 7 years old, I went to the Philippines. It was the second time I'd ever gone to the Philippines. And I think that was the first time at the age of 7 where I knew, love in my family was not unconditional, right? And part of it was, we were visiting my mom's side of the family, and we were staying with like these very wealthy relatives. And, there's 5 kids in the family, and, they're all like mestizo, they're lighter skinned, but they weren't just lighter skinned, like they were trained in equestrian. I don't know how many people ride horses in the Philippines, but here they are. And at night, all the cousins would gather to listen to them sing. And it was just very clear they were the favorite ones. They were the beautiful ones. And they really I'm not going to shame my cousins and say that like they thought of themselves as better than, the Guam cousins, because I don't think that they felt that way. But among the aunties and uncles, there was a clear, like, these are the beautiful cousins. These are the like the good cousins. These, you want to be like them because they're so beautiful. They're so talented. And I remember, like just feeling so inferior. And, and I would also sort of look at like how my mom just lauded my cousins. And I thought, oh my God, like my mom actually, and again, I know in reality, she didn't feel this way, but like, there was this feeling of like, oh, okay, mom loves me a little bit differently than she does the cousins. Right. And so like, I think that was very, as a child, that was very painful. And that same trip, and I have photos of this, like we went to Imelda Park, and Imelda Park is in Baguio, and it's where Filipinos go to gawk at the indigenous Filipinos. And I remember my auntie, who had this habit of always pinching my nose. And when your auntie does that, it's because she's telling you your nose is too flat. And so it's like cheap plastic surgery, right? Like I remember my auntie taking my hand, and she made me hold the hand of one of the young indigenous boys. And she said something along the lines of like, you need to hold his hand because you two match. And it was her telling me like, and I don't think she understood how painful this was or how much this had impacted me, so like that was one thing. And then like fast forward later, when I was in graduate school, my mom and we finally had this conversation, because like I was like, Mom, why do you think that you're so beautiful? Right? Like, why does the family, like, why do you all think you're so beautiful? And so she told me the story of how she became this beauty queen, and there was some drama involved, and the town sort of, like there was this committee that chooses who's going to be the provincial beauty queen every year. And one year my mother was chosen, and she was chosen over her cousin, who the family thought was going to be the queen that year. And so my mom tells me the story. She describes all the drama. And I said, well, Mom, why were you chosen over this auntie? And I will never forget my mother's answer. She goes, because I was prettier than my cousin. She goes, when I was young, I had such beautiful skin. My skin was so fine. and so pretty and so white. Those were her exact words. My skin was so fine and so pretty and so white. Like I was just more beautiful than her. And so, and like when my mother was this beauty queen, the crown was modeled after the Miss America crown. And so like this, in the story, I thought, here's a family story that's so intricately connected to Philippine colonial history, racism, empire. And so that's how I chose to explore the possibility of colorism.
Wow, very impactful, especially with the Indigenous child. Wow. And then our last question that I see is, how would you start a conversation with a family member who is from an older generation regarding their comments about you having a darker complexion?
Thank you for that. That's an excellent question, and one that like I'm often asked. So there are a couple of things. One is when we start to engage and engage in these conversations, especially with our elders, I want to prepare you for a couple of things. One, the outcome that you probably want to have will likely not happen, right? And part of that is because, especially like I've obviously had many years to reflect on this, and a lot of this again is has been informed by like my own relationship with my mother, right? Like, we often, sort of fought over what I felt were her antiquated ideas about beauty, right? And so a couple of things is, one, be prepared for not getting the result that you want. In terms of how we engage, my advice is find the love language in which your elders can respond to, right? Because you can't say, oh, mom, but don't you know you're being a racist? Like you can't come in, like depending on what your elders, love language or response language is, like you can't come in hard that way, right? Like I learned the hard way that I would have to pose questions. So an example is, my cousin, when she had her daughter, everyone in the family was just like gaga over, my niece, because, she's mixed Chinese, Filipino. She had very light skin, very straight hair, and it was light, right? She had like light brown hair, and everyone, oh my God, she's so beautiful. She's so beautiful. And so the way I would start that conversation is, I agree that, this child is beautiful, but are you saying that the other children are not beautiful? Is like, can you explain that to me? And like, I learned that like I would have to just sort of pose those questions so that they could sort of think about the implications of what they're saying, right? It didn't necessarily change their minds completely, but like what I found was effective was to give our elders the opportunity to think about, okay, like what is it that I'm really saying? And I think that tends to sort of open up the conversation. You have to really find that love language. And again, you have to be prepared for like that person's mind may not change, right? But you're trying to plant the seeds because you need to be the person. You need to be the person in the room that at least sparks these conversations, not necessarily just for the elders, but for the younger people in the room who are listening, because they need to witness someone standing up for themselves. They need to witness another adult in the room presenting a different idea about skin tone and beauty, and it's really, at least in my own experience, it's really how you impact younger people. For me, that was the goal, as opposed to sort of like berating my mom. The other thing that helped me was understanding my mom and my aunts, like, the time and context in which they came from, right? Like, I don't think that like my mom and my aunts were trying to purposefully be harmful. They were just articulating generations of messaging that they had absorbed. And if that was the only messaging that they received, of course, that's the only messaging that they were sharing, right? And so like understanding the world that they lived in, the time that they lived in, what it was like to be a young Filipino. Like, of course, these were the messages that they were given and that they were going to share. And so I always felt that like my job was to like lovingly challenge, just so that they can have that moment of pause, but it also because I felt like I needed to be the other adult in the room saying, like for my nieces and nephews, there's another way to understand your value. And then is it Kenja?
Yes, Kenja, thank you.
Sorry, thank you so much for doing this, Joanne. I actually had two questions, and I hope that I can get to both of them. The first question had to do with Cecilia's marriage to Thurgood Marshall and the family's visceral response to that. And, you mentioned marrying up, and I think about somebody who is on the path to becoming Supreme Court Justice. That's kind of marrying up, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that visceral response from her family also had to do with her embracing the politics of not only am I going to marry this African-American man, but I've embraced the political movement that this person is doing. And then that also takes her and her children further away from the American ladder, which would be the white ladder.
Yeah, so so I'm actually not familiar with how Cecilia's family reacted, but I do think that, in terms of like, her marriage to Thurgood Marshall and, like, because in my own research, when, I would ask about perceptions of Black people, at least the interviews that I conducted in the Philippines, the funny thing is I could not find like a consistent response, right? Because I was expecting there to be just like a lot of anti-Black racism, but like there was something about like, if, for example, you're a Filipina and you're married to someone who's African-American, the Americanness overrode Blackness, right? Because like Americanness in the context of the Philippines is so revered. So like I remember one of my my interviewees, she had talked about how she had a crush on a coworker from the United States and he was African-American. And I was like, oh, what was, like, what was that like? And she was like, oh, he was just it was really like his Americanness, right? And I think that narrative seemed to like would override, some of the anti-Black sentiment that I also saw, right, in some of my interviewees. I also want to point out like Thurgood Marshall is also lighter skinned. And so like there's some of that happening, but, and as you pointed out, he's also like very famous, right? He's very, he's a well-known, Supreme Court judge, like, he's, so like on that level, yes, she definitely like married up, and I can see how like her family would have been more, would have embraced him more for those factors, because it's a class issue more than a race issue. But I also don't want to erase like some of the anti-Black sentiment, that occurs in the Filipinx community, and I'm sure this is inappropriate of me airing dirty Filipino laundry, but like what Filipinos say to your face and what they say behind your back, sometimes they're very different. So I hope I answered that question, Kenja.
That's fine. I was totally just curious if how much the political climate became part of her choice, and if that caused also additional ire. My other question, if I have time to answer, this is a deeper, longer question also, is when I think about fair skin and blood purity. Let's thinking about on the global scale, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, and the concerns about the children being dark-skinned. But it's more than skin, it's purity. And I think it's this association with cleaner, purer, nicer, kinder, more angelic people in the skin color game. And I'm wondering if there's issues, if there's in your research, if there's issues of blood purity and race purity that come up with the color game, with the ideas of colorism.
Yeah, I do think that that definitely comes up. But with Filipinos, because there's this acknowledgement that we're so mixed anyway, oftentimes those, the purity questions sort of go out the door because colonial history just made it so that like we're so mixed, right? When I'm sure that there are people that do bring up the question of purity, but again, that goes out the door because of that history of racial mixing. I think that when I was conducting my interviews, something that was more the concern, especially with respect to interracial marriage, was, does this person fit in culturally? Will this person fit in with the family, right? Will they eat our food? Will they, or are they going to see us as less than, right? And I think those were some of the issues that were more prevalent, at least in the samples, in the sample interviews that I did. That seemed to be more prevalent than the question of purity.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you all. I'm just noticing time. We just have a few more minutes, so I'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Angelia, for talking about this very important topic of colorism. We invite all of you to visit her website here on the slide, skimmemoirs.com, where you can sign up to receive links to past writing, along with updates on her research and further writing and public appearances. She's been on some podcasts this year, very good. It will go to the next slide, please. As we also invite you to join us again on another Sunday, on November 13th, when the topic will be bias in healthcare, specifically as it impacts the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Much like today's event, this November webinar is being made possible by National ACE and is intended to support Asian Americans and Pacific Islander entrepreneurs and small business owners. Last slide. If you'd like any additional information about Island Liaison or any of the info presented today, please feel free to reach out to us. Our info is on the slide here. And again, thank you everybody for joining us and for being patient at the beginning. We were running on a little bit of island time. We hope to leave this webinar with new insights and perspectives that will carry through into the larger community and the bigger conversations. Thank you all so much, and happy early Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you.